Shadows of Forever. Prologue. She stands at the centre of a blighted field of barley with her arms outstretched at her sides. In the wind, the crop sways and brushes against her long dress. From the dark clouds, the first spots of rain fall upon her upturned face. But she must not mind this. She is here to perform her magic. She is here to save this crop. At the edge of the field, standing beside a solitary tree grown through the hedgerow, the farmer and his son watch her. They are there with the stoic shire horse and the cart, which brought them all out to this lonely acreage. The farmer has a haggard face. The boy is 17, strong and handsome. The old man had become a father late in life. With a voice that is high and clear, the young woman recites the ancient words of her ritual, words that will drive the devils from this soil and make it fertile once more. As if responding to her, the wind rises, the rain begins to descend without inhibition, and she feels the conductivity of her body draw the power of the earth through the soles of her feet, passing it up and away towards the storm sky. Chapter 1. A dead-end street, and the terraced Victorian houses occupying it were a decade into neglect. Paint was flaking from window frames and soffits. Slates were missing from roofs. Cramped front gardens were choked by overgrown shrubs, which in turn partially hid a variety of dumped items: a fridge, a toilet bowl, a motorbike. Several properties were boarded up, and many of the others looked as if they should be. In a different part of town, estate agents might have said they possessed potential, but here, with sad resignation, they waited only for the wrecking cranes to come. The few untaxed, flat-tired junkers rotting at the curbs made a fine job of enhancing the area's arse end of the world feel. There was, however, one diamond in this rough. In the shade where the sun had not yet dissolved the frost, a Lexus LS 460 lay in wait like a crouching black panther. Behind its tinted windows, a man adjusted the telephoto lens of his top-end digital SLR camera and focused on his subject. She was working on the forecourt of a small workshop 100 metres further down the street, towards the main road end, where traffic and people went about their business, heedless of the slum they'd see if they cared to turn their heads. The girl's jeans tightened across her backside as she leaned across the bonnet of a red MGB, vigorously polishing it. Click. One photograph. Autumn sunlight flashed off the car's windscreen as the girl moved to one side. Click. Her blonde ponytail bobbed as she worked the polishing cloth back and forth across the paintwork. Click. Her breasts shimmied inside her white t-shirt. The man was framing a further shot in the viewfinder when a group of 6 or 7 kids, listlessly kicking a football along the street, passed in front of it. The tallest youth, the one with the back-to-front baseball cap jammed on his head, was maybe 14 years old. The rest were any combination of ages, sizes and sexes, and dressed in the standard uniform of their generation: cargo trousers, hooded sweatshirts, Nike and Adidas trainers. The man lowered his camera and watched as the group ambled past the forecourt. The boys had plenty of lewd comments to make to the girl, but she ignored them, and the laughter. Little shits, the man thought. They weren't worthy to crawl in her shadow. The tall kid, showing off his footwork, danced around the football. He flicked it onto his instep and tried, unsuccessfully, to keep it balanced there. One of the other boys tackled him clumsily and the ball spun off into the air. It bounced on the forecourt close to the MG and, energy spent, rolled towards the girl like an obedient dog. She kicked it back towards the kids, and a ragged cheer went up. The leader took it on his chest and brought it under control. "Better than Wayne Rooney," he shouted. There was a large bell mounted high on the outside wall of the workshop, there to alert anyone who was working outside that there was a phone call. It rang now. The girl set the cloth and polish on the concrete apron beside the MG and slipped through the open sliding doors and into the comparative gloom of the workshop. The man carefully laid his camera on the passenger seat of the Lexus and climbed out. He shrugged into his cashmere overcoat, for although the sun was bright, the air was chill. It tasted good, though, clean, and carried the faint taste of the sea on it. On the ridge of the corrugated workshop roof, seagulls hopped and squabbled while others wheeled and called in the faultless blue sky. The man crossed the road. A discreet hand-painted sign mounted on the wall beside the workshop doors proclaimed that these were the business premises of Abby Hawthorne, restorer of classic cars. The kids were still hanging about further down the street. The man stood beside the MG watching them. "What are you looking at, mate?" the leader called out. The man said nothing, and within a couple of seconds the kid had broken eye contact, as if, without fully knowing why, he had averted his gaze from the dark and foreboding entrance of a cave. The man was well aware that he sometimes had this effect on others. One of the girls said something to the boy, giving the man a sidelong glance at the same time, and then the pack finally moved on. The man stepped inside the workshop and saw Abby, her back to him, talking on the phone in the small glass-partitioned office at the rear. She exasperatedly pushed her hand through her hair, this gesture suggesting that whatever the call was about, it wasn't going particularly well. The man hesitated. He spent his days thinking about Abby Hawthorne. He spent his nights dreaming of her. But now that the time had come for him to move to the next level, to turn the fantasy into reality, he found himself paralyzed, like a teenager about to ask for his first date, and that was unacceptable. In material terms, he was a success, well accustomed to getting what he wanted, and that mindset must apply now. He would reach out and take Abby from the pedestal upon which he had placed her. He would make her his or go mad trying. On some level, perhaps that madness had already manifested, because this obsession could not be normal. Normal or not, it drove him. He stepped forward, and as he did so, Abby Hawthorne turned and saw him. Chapter 2. "Don't push it, Nick," Abby said. "The jury's out on whether I ever want to see you again, and believe me, it's not looking good." Nick Lomax, on the other end of the line, was trying hard to contain his frustration. "We need to talk about this, Abby, for Christ's sake." "You do," she thought. "I don't." She would have said it out loud too, if she hadn't turned slightly and noticed the man standing politely just outside the open office door. He gave her a brief smile of acknowledgement, which she returned. She recognized him from somewhere. She prided herself on remembering names and faces, past and present, the personal touch which gave her an edge in her business. But this guy wasn't a client nor a motor trade rep. She was sure of that. "Are we on for tonight, then?" Nick persisted. He sounded almost desperate, and Abby liked the idea of that just fine. Spiteful? Yes, but he deserved it. "Maybe." She tuned him out, the conversation at an end as far as she was concerned. She pressed the disconnect button, her attention now on her visitor. He stepped into the office, clocking the posters blue-tacked to the wall. Seals, koalas, tigers, courtesy of the World Wildlife Fund, and a selection of classic cars. Abby switched on her best customer-facing smile and asked how she could help. "She's a beautiful machine," the man said by way of an answer, appraising a blow-up of a Jaguar XK 150. "To die for," Abby agreed. The guy was in his early to mid-50s, well-groomed and confident, but his eyes were his most striking feature, grey, intense, perhaps a little unsettling. "I've recently acquired one," he said, handing Abby a business card. "She's in poor condition, and I need someone to restore her to full health." He paused, his expensive smile widening. "I'd like you to consider the job." Morton Stoner, the card read, chairman and managing director, Solar Gold Properties, so this guy was unlikely to be a time waster. He had money to spend. "Can I ask where you heard about me?" Abby said, as if she didn't already know the answer. Stoner pulled a rolled-up copy of Auto World magazine from his coat pocket and laid it on the counter. "They did a good write-up on you," he said. "I was impressed." An image of Abby's face grinned back at her from the front cover of the magazine. The photographer had posed in her overalls, spanner in hand, leaning over the engine of a Triumph Stag. Stoner was right. The article had been a good one. Written 6 months previously, it had generated a great deal of work for Abby. The story angle, of course, was that as a young, attractive female, she was a rarity in the male world of classic vehicle restoration. She had no illusions that it was as responsible as anything else for the stream of male clients arriving at her workshop door, but she wasn't hung up about it. What the hell? If you've got it, use it. That was her philosophy. Her increased workload brought its own problems, though. "I have to tell you," she said, "there's a waiting list and I can't take on any more large projects at the moment. You can see how it is." She indicated the workshop with an inclination of her head. Hard up against the whitewashed wall was an inspection pit with a ramp above it, and cars were lined up nose to tail across the rest of the floor. Late afternoon sunlight slanted through dusty windows onto the roofs, boots and bonnets of an Alfa Romeo, a Triumph, an Alvis. Scattered about were axles, partially dismantled engines and Dexion shelves piled with spare parts. Basically, there wasn't the room to squeeze in a grocer's bike, let alone another car. "All right," Stoner said, unfazed. "So let me suggest this. Do an appraisal for me. Let me know what you think. You wouldn't have to commit to going any further." Abby took a wistful look at the poster of the XK. This was one car which had not yet passed through her hands for restoration, and here was an opportunity that wouldn't come her way too often. She was her own worst enemy, and she knew it, but what harm would a quick look do? Standing on the forecourt, thoughtfully sipping from a can of Diet Coke, she watched Morton Stoner drive away. The sun had slipped quickly below the rooftops, and the temperature had fallen with it. Abby's breath clouded in front of her, and there were goosebumps on her bare arms. She couldn't shake the feeling that she'd seen Stoner somewhere before, and it was bugging her. Chapter 3. It was just after 7 o'clock. Nick was smoking a cigarette leaning against the bonnet of his Mini when Abby drove her Mitsubishi Warrior into the pub car park. She didn't know why the hell she was doing this. It wasn't because she wanted to listen to Nick's whinging excuses all over again, or that she was in any sort of mood to forgive him, or even because she still had feelings at all, the right kind of feelings, for him. They'd been together for 3 years, and there had been plenty of good times. Of course there had. But to Abby right now, it felt like those good times had been spent with a different person. Nick, as always, was immaculately dressed. Ben Sherman shirt, designer leather jacket. He wore his blonde hair shaggy and long, which made him look like a cross between Jamie Oliver and David Soul during his Hutch period. He took a last long drag on his cigarette and tossed the butt away as Abby pulled into the space beside him and climbed out of the Warrior. "I was about to give up on you," he said. Abby glared at him. "Don't start, Nick, or I'm out of here, right now." All right. Lomax held up his hands in mock surrender. "I was joking. Let's not start off on the wrong foot." Abby thought it was a bit late for a statement like that. They went into the pub through the rear entrance, passing a forlorn collection of wooden tables, waiting for summer in the shadows of the garden. The saloon bar was busy for midweek. Posters, handwritten with marker pen, advertised the karaoke starting at 8:30. The gear had been set up in a corner. It might be a good idea if they could be out of there before that kicked off. Nick brought their drinks over to the window seat, just as an old guy started thumbing coins into the fruit machine next to it. Nick took a slug from his bottle of Budweiser, but Abby waited, leaving her Coke and ice untouched. She wasn't going to initiate the conversation. "I'd start by saying sorry," Nick said at last, "except it sounds inadequate." "You could try saying it anyway," Abby told him. Nick nodded, suitably chastened. Or at least, he looked as if he was suitably chastened. Abby knew from bitter experience, though, that he could put on an act with the best of them. "Yeah, well, I am sorry. I know I've screwed this up. You screwed someone else, that's what you did." The man playing the slot machine shot them a sideways glance, but he wasn't about to let any unfolding drama here put him off. He nudged a button with the heel of his hand, and the machine responded with a chorus of happy electronic beeps and burbles. This was followed by the clatter of coins in the payout tray. A lucky night. Nick lowered his voice. "What do you think? That I'm proud of that? I didn't just do it for the hell of it. You told me already, Abby said. I got the picture, Nick. It's my fault. How did it go? You've never got time for us, Abby. You're always working. She paused. You're pathetic, Nick. If that's the best excuse you can come up with for going off and shagging another woman. Shows how highly you rate our relationship. This business of yours is taking over, Lomax said, staring into his drink. You need to get a life. So how is it different for you and your job? The shifts, the times you've stood me up because you've been working late on some case? I can't just walk away from it like that. And I can? Abby shot back. We're not playing by the same rules here, are we? She finally took a sip of her drink. She didn't want another row. Not here, not now. She and Nick had already had the teeth and claws set too, and she'd thought it had purged her of most of the anger and hurt, leaving her able to look at the situation coolly and calmly. Obviously, she was wrong. Maybe it proved she did still care after all. Nick tried a conciliatory tone. I thought it would be a good idea if we got away, and Abby nearly spluttered a mouthful of Coke all over the table. What? You know, just the two of us, to sort out what's gone wrong. We'd end up killing each other, Abby said. Nick nervously started to tap the side of his glass. The thing is, I've booked the hotel for this weekend. It's in Dorset. Abby stared at him, then shook her head in disbelief. Jesus. When it came to dropping bombshells, Nick Lomax could give the Enola Gay a run for its money. Hang on, can I get this straight? First you go off and have a one-night stand, then you blame me for it, and now you think you're going to be able to make it all right by whisking me off for a dirty weekend, and you don't even ask me first. Christ, what do you think, Nick, that I'm so besotted with you that a ploy like that is actually going to work? She stood up and put her jacket on. Nick's expression was full of pleading. I just wanted to... Abby ruthlessly cut him off. I seriously thought about not turning up tonight, she said. You know what? I wish I hadn't. As she walked away, Nick called after her. The hotel's paid for. Then find someone else in your little black book to take. Abby didn't look back as she said it. For a few seconds, every other conversation in the pub died. Chapter 4. A cold morning. Wood smoke from a crooked chimney drifted across treetops. Blue Jay's cottage, built centuries ago at the foot of the rising fields and woods, slumbered as the oaks, chestnuts and beeches of the Sussex countryside silently shed their autumn crisp leaves all around it. This was a place caught in a time warp. It had a Lost Valley feel about it, a fairy tale quality. Skye Willowmoon, witch, healer, herbalist and sole human occupant of the cottage, made her slow way along a line of dilapidated hutches constructed beneath a large horse-chestnut tree. The small wooden cart she pulled behind her contained straw, water and food for the few creatures in her care. Her ginger cat, Ostara, prowled the leaf-strewn tops of the hutches, keeping pace. The people of the district still brought Skye sick and injured animals from time to time. Bats, birds, badgers, even field mice and once an unwanted goat which she had kept. Recently, though, she'd been passing the majority on to the wildlife sanctuary a few miles down the road. She felt so tired these days, unable sometimes to summon the energy to look after herself, or to do the necessary chores around the cottage, let alone care for other creatures. She called herself a healer, but she couldn't heal herself. She couldn't stop her disease or old age eating away at her. When it came down to it, she was as mortal as anyone else. She propped her walking stick against the second-to-last hutch in the row, opened the wire mesh door, and with her back muscles protesting, bent down and lifted out the resident, a hedgehog with a bandaged leg. Skye brought the animal level with her face. Their noses were almost touching. "Hello, my little one," she said softly. She put him in the empty hutch next door, while she replenished food and water and replaced bedding straw. She'd just finished when the pain hit her, familiar and terrifying, fast and hard, She doubled up, clutching her stomach. It felt like someone was roasting her insides with a blowtorch. Unable to move, scarcely able to breathe, she counted the seconds until the worst of the attack subsided. This time it had lasted longer. Hadn't it? Maybe. Or perhaps it was just her imagination. But sooner or later, the frequency of the spasms would increase and the pain must intensify. There was nothing she could do to prevent it happening. There could only be one release from it. With a trembling hand, she pushed herself against the roof of the hutch and straightened up. Ostara sensed her distress. She pressed her flank against Skye's legs, meowing as she gazed up at her mistress. Another leaf detached itself from a high bough, spun lazily in the cold air, and brushed Skye's cheek on its way to the ground. She closed her eyes and waited until the last of the pain ebbed away. "It's all right, Ostara," she said to the cat, her voice not much more than a whisper. "Another silly twinge, that's all." She didn't know who she was trying to fool, not herself and probably not Ostara either. The wick of the brass oil lamp was turned fully up, but her eyes were still feeling strained. The attack she had suffered earlier in the day had left her enervated. She knew she should rest. Still, she was almost done for tonight. Skye slid the papers into the manila envelope, but didn't seal it, not yet, turned it over and wrote on it, "For the attention of James Knight, in the event of my death." She put her pen down, gathered up the rest of her papers, and pushed them back into the various cubby holes of her writing bureau. It was a Dickensian-looking piece of furniture, scratched, knocked and worn, and it had belonged to her father. In his time it would never have contained what it did now: notebooks full of local folk tales, herbal remedies and healing spells, some lines of poetry on torn pieces of paper, and all sorts of observations Skye had made about the countryside over the years. There were other scrapbooks containing pressed wildflowers and pencil drawings. This desk, this small room with its musty bookshelves full of nature, folklore and witchcraft, held the essence of her life. She leaned back in her chair, removed her glasses, massaged her tense neck muscles, and felt the chain there. A heavy pentacle hung from it. She reached inside her shirt and lifted it out. Ostara jumped onto the bureau and delicately sniffed the charm, but she quickly lost interest. With a fingertip, Skye traced the edge of the pentacle. It was one of a pair she had once owned. She hadn't thought about Abby Hawthorne for a long time, years, possibly, and then only in the sense of, "I wonder what she's doing now." But recently, the girl had been on her mind a great deal. Skye knew why too. She wasn't sure she could rely on her instincts any more than she could her body these days, but they were persistent, and they were saying this: Abby was in trouble. The oil lamp spluttered a little. "Premonitions, Ostara," Skye said. "They'll be the death of me." If her illness didn't get her first, of course. The cat wasn't listening. She was more interested in following the antics of a moth which was fluttering around the lamp, stupidly bashing itself against the glass shade. Skye sighed and slipped the pentacle back inside her shirt. Chapter 5. Abby sometimes felt a fraud driving her Chelsea tractor around town, but here, negotiating this private road, it came into its own. The surface, if you could call it that, consisted of patchy tarmac, infills of loose stones and potholes which looked like they'd been made by mortar shells. No doubt the residents had them mapped in their heads, thus avoiding expensive suspension damage to their Bentleys and Astons. Abby drove slowly, studying the impressive houses to the left and right, searching for Morton Stoner's place. There was big money here, and it was jealous of its exclusivity. It hid at the end of long driveways, behind tall rhododendron bushes and stands of silver birches, and it insisted that you did not come close unless you were invited. The road was a cul-de-sac. At the end was a leaf-strewn turnaround ringed by trees, and only one house. Abby pulled up in front of the wrought-iron gates. Fixed to one of the stone pillars was a brass plaque, which informed her she'd found Oaken Hill House. She turned down the sound system volume and peered through the gates. This place had the wow factor, that was for sure. A CCTV camera mounted on top of a pillar swiveled soundlessly and angled down at her until she was looking straight into its lens. Seconds later, the gate swung smoothly inwards and Abby drove through and onto the curving gravel driveway. She wouldn't have been surprised to see deer grazing between the mature oaks in the park-like grounds, but there were, however, only a couple of gardeners raking leaves. She stopped in front of the wide steps which lead up to the red brick mansion. She didn't know much about architecture, but she thought it might be Georgian, with its symmetrical lines, rows of high sash windows, white cornices and stately chimneys. As she climbed out of the Warrior, clipboard in hand, the front door of the house opened and Morton Stoner stepped out to greet her. He told her he was glad she could make it and that he'd been looking out for her. She thought of the CCTV camera above the gate and imagined him sitting in front of banks of monitors, watching and waiting. The image made her feel a touch uneasy, and she quickly pushed it away. The entrance hall of Oaken Hill House was a space of light and air, chandeliers, intricate ceiling mouldings of ribbons and swags, classical figures and urns. A wide staircase curved up to the first floor. Abby was impressed, and said so. Some upmarket interior designer had made a lot of money here. Stoner smiled and thanked her for the compliment. "Can I get you anything before we continue? Tea? Coffee? Something stronger?" "No, thanks. I need to get back fairly quickly." "Of course." "Well, the car's the star," Stoner said, and the smile didn't falter. He lightly touched the small of her back. "Shall we?" She followed him along the hallway, across oriental rugs laid on bare floorboards, towards the rear of the house. At the end, a narrower passage dog-legged to the right. There was carpeting along here and no daylight. The only illumination came from hooded brass lamps mounted above pictures of equine scenes. "She's been sitting in a barn for 20 years, can you believe?" Stoner told Abby over his shoulder. "I don't think the farmer knew what he had. Still, his loss is my gain." At the far end of the corridor, a door opened into a hangar of a garage. The place had the feel of an underground car park, late at night, and it was just as cold. The only vehicles occupying the space were Stoner's Lexus and the Jaguar XKE. Abby followed her host down a short flight of steps and across the concrete floor, the click of his heels echoing in the emptiness. The Jag was a 1959 S Roadster, the open two-seater, carmine red, biscuit leather upholstery, a dream. It was supported on axle stands, the wire wheels stacked in a corner, still shod with white wall tyres. As I said, the poor old dear's seen better days. Stoner was standing a few paces behind Abby, as if there was a magic circle surrounding the car which he was afraid to enter. He wasn't wrong about the vehicle's condition. The paintwork was dull, the chrome trim rusty, and there was a headlight missing. The flat, unforgiving light from the garage fluorescents didn't do it any favours either. It gave it the air of a body on an autopsy table. "Can I take a closer look?" Abby asked. "That's why you're here," Stoner said. She walked slowly around the car, trailing her fingertips along the dusty bodywork, casting a professional eye over it. Despite its neglected condition, the Jag still oozed class. Depending on the level of restoration Stoner required, there would be a job to do here. This wouldn't be a 5-minute project. Abby dropped to one knee, tucked her hair behind her ear, and peered underneath. The chassis looked sound enough, although some flakes of rust had fallen to the floor. She made some notes on her clipboard, then reached inside the cockpit, released the bonnet catch, stepped round the front, and propped it up on its stay. Shoehorned into the narrow engine compartment, the XK's 3.8-litre straight-six double overhead cam engine had been dead and cold a long time. It would probably require stripping down and rebuilding, at least that would be Abby's recommendation. One of the triple SU HD8 carburetors was missing, but otherwise the power unit looked to be intact. Abby leaned over the wing for a better look into the depths of the engine compartment and saw that there was a bird's nest, for God's sake, wedged between the starter motor and the block. She made more notes and closed the bonnet. Aware that Stoner was still watchful behind her, she slid into the driver's seat and, with her arms outstretched, gripped the steering wheel, 10-2 position. There was nothing in front of her except the practically opaque windscreen, and beyond that, the triple garage doors. But in her mind's eye, she was wearing dark glasses, her hair streaming behind her, and a country road rolling out ahead, sunlight dappling through the trees. She was downshifting, and she was hearing the perfectly tuned purr of that 6-cylinder engine as it produced maximum torque. "So what do you think?" Stoner said, breaking her reverie. "Have I bought a pig in a poke?" Reluctantly, Abby let go of the steering wheel and rested her hands on the clipboard in her lap. "No, she just needs plenty of tender loving care, that's all." "And could you supply it?" "I'd like to think so." She got out of the car and stood beside Stoner, weighing up options, dreaming of the phoenix she could coax from these ashes. "Then when can you start?" Stoner wanted to know, turning to her. She laughed a little. "You haven't even asked me how much it would cost." "All right then. How much will it cost?" Abby glanced at her notes. Of course, it wasn't that simple. "I'll have to work out a figure and get back to you. There are a few factors that—" Stoner held up his hand to silence her. "You aren't planning to rip me off, are you?" "No, of course not." "Then your figure is academic. Whatever it is, I can afford to pay it." Abby blew out her cheeks and looked at the clipboard again, as if the scribblings there could tell her what she should do. The fact was, she was being handed this on a plate, and she didn't understand why. Stoner was obviously nobody's fool, so what was going on here? Why this pressure to take on the work no matter what? There was no doubt that this was a fantastic opportunity, one that Abby was loath to turn down, because if she did, Stoner might not offer her the chance again. That didn't stop her feeling uncomfortable about the situation, though. "This was supposed to be an appraisal, Mr. Stoner," she reminded him, "not a commitment. As much as I'd love to, there's no way I can take it on right now. So when would you be available?" "We're looking at 6 months, realistically." 6 months, give or take. Stoner studied her face. "I see," he said. "Look," Abby went on quickly, realizing that she was about to cut off her nose to spite her face. "I can recommend 1 or 2 guys. They might be able to tackle it sooner for you." "I don't want second-raters." "You wouldn't be getting them. They're good. You've got my word." "Good they might be, but they're not the best." "Neither am I, if that's what you're getting at." Stoner was looking straight into Abby's eyes, and she felt it again, that frisson of recognition, the sense that she'd seen Morton Stoner somewhere before. She still couldn't place where. "That's exactly what I'm getting at," he said. Abby looked away, refocusing her attention on the car. "I'm sorry. If there was any way I could do it, I would, believe me." Stoner sighed. "Well then, if I can't have the best right now, I'll have to curb my impatience until it becomes available, won't I?" Then he smiled, as if it was of no consequence to him at all. On the way back to her Warrior, Abby saw, fleetingly, a face peering out at her from one of the downstairs windows of the house. A woman in late middle age, hair tied back severely, and boy did she have an expression on her, like she sucked lemons for a hobby. The wife. Only Abby had noticed that Stoner was not wearing a wedding ring, which of course could mean nothing at all.